We have lost our way. It's undeniable at this point. We don't know exactly where, we don't know exactly when, we don't know precisely how, but we know it. Some people will be in denial and say, no, it's always like this, it's always been this way, but that's not true. It shouldn't be like this. Life shouldn't be like this. It doesn't have to be this hard. We have too much stuff, we have too much tech, we have too much money, we have too much power. For it to have gotten harder and harder and harder, it should have gotten easier and easier. We know it. We feel it inside of ourselves. We've run out of story. We've run out of narrative. We don't know what we're doing. We have now completely lost our way. I'm not sure that greed is good, but greed is. It's kind of a evolutionary software fault that humans have. We're stuck with it. It developed out of a positive drive. You should take more than you need. If you're going on a long journey and you don't know if there'll be food on the way, take food with you. If you don't know when your next meal is going to come, eat more than you need. Store it. Keep it in you. As above, so below. As within, so without. We store within our body extra energy that we don't burn up. And so we need to store food. We need to store resources. Then there's an impulse to take more than we need. And we call this greed. But I think it has a justifiable evolutionary drive. But that evolutionary hangover, that little human software fault that we developed from evolving in extremely low resource and difficult environments, like all little human software faults, can be exploited. We're doing it to each other. We're doing it to ourselves because you can. And through exploiting other people's greed, you can feed your own desire for excess, your own hunger for more. And by that principle, consumer capitalism was born. Not that you will buy what it is that you need, but that you will buy what it is that you want. And the more you want, the more you buy. And so it was of benefit, it was of profit to gain that excess capital, that excess wealth, to provoke greed and lust and envy in people, to fuel the very economy itself. And you frame it in these dramatic terms, it sounds like some sort of evil empire. Maybe. It is what it is. It is what it is. Our economy doesn't function without greed, without lust, without envy. It behooves the people who are in power, who are in control, the heads of corporations and the boards behind them, to inspire envy and to inspire greed in people. We should love people and use things, but now what we're doing is using people and loving things. And that is the trap that we set for ourselves with consumer capitalism.
You say consumer capitalism is ruining everything, but do you even have a solution?
Well, there isn't really a fix for consumer capitalism because it's in everything we're doing. It's in everything we eat, everything we do, everything we think. It's just a major part of the system that we live inside of. It is the very essence of the matrix itself. So you could try and regulate it more, but of course, then you're going to face massive pushback from huge conglomerates and corporations because you're affecting their bottom line. They're addicted. The entire economy is now addicted to consumer capitalism. People need to buy cheap crap that was produced, almost slave labor essentially, in foreign countries in order for our economy to keep going. So you need a hard reset. They have the great reset. I propose the hard reset. And it would be painful. The economy would really, really struggle if you overnight took away any element of consumer capitalism. You're only going to have an economy where you can only buy the things that you need. Of all of the problems I have proposed, this would be the hardest one to fix at this point. It seems to be that we're the victims of our own success as a species. It's a sick joke. And when I was thinking about it, I was thinking, well, what's happened? What are we going through right now? We as a species are no longer a good evolutionary match for the environment that we've created. And what environment did we create? We created an environment that has technology in it. And technology and progress go hand in hand. For a civilization to recede or to collapse, it needs to stop growing. But civilizational growth, technology, progress all work together. So is it inevitable? So I had to ask myself a question. What is tech? Like, where does it begin? Are you going to cite the Industrial Revolution? Are you going to talk about the development of guns or swords? Where do you go? I went all the way back and I was thinking, no, I think you have to look at Neanderthals and our cousins in the animal kingdom. If you're using a tool to get something done, that is tech. If you wear an animal skin to stay a little bit warmer, that's tech. Better tech, progress must be if the animal skin doesn't just keep you warm, it keeps you dry. And if it goes over more of your body and is more comfortable, that's technological progress. Then you accelerate that over a longer timeline and you have iPhones, you have people dopamine addicted to social media. It's inevitable and it's part of growth, it's part of progress, it's part of a civilizational and economic expanse that we've fallen prey to. We've been dreaming of the cities of light for literally millennia, a place where there's always warmth, always shelter, always safety from your enemies, food, calories, an abundance of choice, an abundance of lifestyles, an abundance of identities, an abundance of different ways of dressing, of thinking, of being, pure liberal options. And we have never been more miserable. And I think it must be biological. It must be, because we're just not evolved to live with this much stuff and this much technology and this many options. Our evolutionary match is probably for something that is a little bit more restricted than this. I really don't know what the answer is to that. Do we deliberately set technology back? Do we deliberately put civilization back so that we can continue to exist? I wouldn't want to make that decision. The way I try to make sense of this for myself is I try to think, okay, timeline of humanity. What was the environment that we evolved in? What were the environmental pressures that caused us to evolve in the way that we did, so that we have the behaviors and the inclinations that we do now? And I presume that if our behaviors and inclinations are a good match for the environment we have, then we experience, if not happiness, peace or contentment at least. And so I think, okay, so what were we for the longest period of time? How did we live before this? Because this thing of cities and houses is nothing. It's been here for the blink of an eye, maybe, I don't know, for most of us, 1,000 years, 2,000. Beginning of the agricultural revolution is what, 8,000, 10,000 years ago? All of this is new. Living on top of each other is new. Living inside of cities is new. All this stuff is new. And these environmental pressures, of course, haven't had the time yet to influence our evolution, because evolution takes time, much longer than this. Technology inevitably becomes self-destructive. It's like a snake eating its own tail, because the tech, the stuff that we've developed to help us, is going to develop faster than we can evolve to catch up with what the tech is doing. We used to be in groups of, say, 30 to 80 people. That was what we spent most of our evolutionary period doing. Hunter-gatherers, a very simple, very brutal life, but with lots of social cohesion, loads of social interaction with a small number of people who you would know by name, and everybody would know you by name. When you worked and you produced something, or you defended your tribe, the result of that work, of that effort, was immediate, and you saw the gratification in people you knew around you, other human beings looking at you. Our reward system cannot be evolved for us to only experience pleasure as an individual. It must be adapted to give us pleasure when we contribute to some kind of a tribe, some kind of a community. Like I said, it's got to be 30 to 80 people, because the longest timeline with the highest degree of evolutionary pressure that was consistent was groups of 30 to 80 people living inside of a community. I do something for you, you do something for me, the community does something for me, and these are all people who I see the fruits of my labor. I see it. Either I'm enjoying it, or the people closest to me, the people who I depend upon for my survival are enjoying it, and I have a reputation for that, and I have a name for that. And look at what we have today. The desire to build reputations, the desire to have that recognition, the desire for some kind of social approval. But how do you get it? Become a social media influencer? Instead of a smile or a touch or physical help in your actual life, you get a like. And that's technological progress. This is what technology inevitably does. This is what civilization must inevitably do. And this is why I think there must be an inevitability to us becoming alienated from each other and alienated from our own work. If you think about war and you think about violence and technology, at the lowest level of technology and violence, I use my hand to hit you. Then I pick up a rock and I hit you with a rock. Then I sling the rock at you and I get further and further and further away from you with less and less calories burned to do more and more injuries. Isn't that alienation? Isn't there, in a weird, sick way, like a loss of intimacy in the violence? Even my violence becomes alienated. I'm even alienated from killing. And we see that now. That's drone warfare or nuclear warfare. You don't even hear their screams. You don't smell the carnage and the damaged flesh, the burned flesh. It's happening miles and miles away. Tell me that's not civilizational progress. How isn't it? So alienation is inevitable. But what does alienation actually do to the individual and to the community? In the individual, alienation from your work and alienation from other people and alienation from your own actions, I claim, will breed the worst of the mental health issues that we see today. Rampant anxiety, huge amounts of body dysmorphia, rampant depression, narcissism and psychopathy, and huge amounts of emotional dysregulation across the board. I would ascribe the majority of that to alienation. Being alienated from each other is a physical problem, not a, don't get vague and wispy and think it's psychology, philosophy. No, this is physical. Your body responds to alienation in a bad way. It physically hurts to be separated from other human beings. We're not evolved for this. To be separated from your own work and the fruits of your labor physically causes pain. It will create anxiety, depression, and all rage even, all these other effects. Your perception's warping. And then you become obsessive and you have weird drives for other things like recognition. I want to be famous. I'm so invisible. I need to be seen. How do I get seen quickly? Maybe murder some people. It's horrible. It's barbaric. But if we look from that evolutionary point of view, a little dispassion, a little detachment, doesn't it make sense?
Technology is too ingrained in our daily lives. It will be impossible to break away from it. Do you really have a solution?
The solution to the problem of technology is tough because there isn't any way that you can restrict the use of technology without restricting progress and without restricting civilization itself. But I would argue that is something that we just have to do. And maybe it's a question of perspective. And maybe if we could universally agree, look, technology is wonderful. It does many amazing things for us, but it is an actual existential threat. The division and polarization it naturally and inevitably causes is an actual imminent threat today. And we just can't afford to have a freewheeling, completely liberal, do whatever you want with it attitude. We have to recognize it as powerful, a truly powerful force in the world. And as any powerful force, it can do good and it can do evil. We need to recognize it can do an awful lot of harm, as much harm as it does good. And as such, we should regulate it as much as we do anything else. I'm not for big government. I'm not for authoritarianism, but I really don't see how we stop the negative impact of technology without saying to people, look, you just can't use it the way that you've been used to using it in this unregulated, unrestricted way. It is harming you.
It is harming the people around you. We have the data and the research and the statistics that prove that beyond a shadow of a doubt. We have to restrict and control and regulate its usage and its development at this point.
Religiosity, orthodoxy, and the impulse to control. Maybe these were good impulses. Maybe they're adaptive in evolutionary terms. If you believe in God, you believe in an orthodoxy, you practice what the rest of the tribe practices, there's probably better group cohesion. There's probably a stronger sense of identity within the tribe that increases survivability, especially in the face of opposition by other tribes with whom we're competing for resources, let's say. The desire to coerce and control the behavior of others, again, could be adaptive. It could be rooted in a desire to stop people from being lazy within a tribal hunter-gatherer context, from being exploitative or mean-spirited or non-generous. Things that could potentially damage the survivability of the tribe. So the impulse towards orthodoxy and religiosity, and the impulse towards controlling and coercing other people's behaviors that leads into a kind of authoritarianism, I'm claiming, are there.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives.
And they're showing up now at this point in our civilization. What does it take for them to show up? I would suggest probably, again, a degree of success. We've been successful, largely speaking, as a civilization, whether we've been enlightened or kind or expressed the highest order moral values in accordance with Greek philosophers. That is to be questioned, but broadly speaking, in survival terms, we are fat, wealthy, full of options in a way that we've never seen before in recorded human history. I'll call that success. So I'm claiming that these impulses really can only start to show up and thrive in an environment where people have the time and the luxury for them to be exercised, because there's really no threat here. Other periods of history, the obvious one to look at would be the Inquisition and the witch trials. But we have to understand that the people of the time really naively and authentically believed that the people that they were denouncing and attacking and scapegoating actually were guilty of something. And if you look at the court records from those times, there is a worry that they're doing things that attack the community, such as driving pigs insane, or spreading disease amongst cattle, or doing things to make the wife of another farmer lust after you or after Satan. These are real things that are documented in the court documents that witches, both male and female, were accused of doing, tortured for, dunked, and ultimately killed, hanged, burned to death, you name it. Nowadays, there aren't the physical imprisonments and taking of people's property and absorbing it into the state or the church as it was back then, but the non-physical, scapegoating, vilifying, denouncing, the hysterical screeching, the desire to express one's individual rage and frustration from the safe confines of a mob. It's cowardly and sadistic and cruel, doesn't reflect the best in people, doesn't say anything nice about humanity, and yet it is. We see it, we're living with it. The impulses towards orthodoxy and the other impulses towards coercing and controlling the behavior of others, and as I say, these may be adaptive, they may be ultimately, in evolutionary terms, positive drives in terms of our survivability. Nowadays, though, they're little more than poison. They divide people, they polarize people, they make us lose our faith in each other. They've caused us to lose our faith in our institutions, even as our institutions delve deeper and deeper into this sort of ideological mass hysteria, where we become obsessed with crimes that were not considered crimes as recently as 5 years ago. And now they're crimes so severe that you can have jobs taken away from you, and careers taken away from you. And there are people out there now working night and day to do exactly that to those who have been marked, identified sinners. They are to be punished. They are to be humiliated in the town square, hanged, drawn, and then quartered, albeit in cyberspace, albeit their reputation, not their bodies, that suffer this mortification and humiliation and destruction. Where this is going, I would suspect that as the purity tests develop along a timeline, they have to become stricter and stricter. And if you compare it to other ideological infections inside of civilizations, they tend to burn out. And you have two things. You're either going to end up with a population of potential targets who are no longer tolerant of this kind of ideological inquisition, or a diminished population, no more victims, and so the people who are running the orthodoxy have to turn on themselves. And we have seen multiple historical instances of this.
The people who we face, who are ideologically infected in this current wave, are not tolerant. They are not patient. They are not reasonable. They are not kind. They are not rational. And they aren't actually largely interested in debate or reason. They're interested in power. They're interested in getting their way. We should recognize that and then become equally as intolerant of them as they are of us. They are very intolerant of their opponents. They will ride roughshod all over them to get what they want in the positions of power that they want them to be in. I don't see another solution. I don't think reasoning our way out of this is going to be the way. I don't think kindness, fawning, submission, negotiating is going to be the way. I think really it's just time to say no. We're not going to go along with what you're doing. These are not reasonable demands. We don't want to move back to racial segregation. Thank you. We've already run that experiment. We didn't like it, and that's why we got rid of it. We don't want to go back to rampant rank sexism. Thank you. We spent thousands of years doing that. We didn't like it. It's strange, really, because civilizational progress brought us to this point, and it's almost as if covertly through the unconscious, this movement is an effort to take us back. But to take us back not to any of the good elements of our past, but to the darkest elements of our past, which rely on division, racial and ethnic and cultural and national division. If I'm going to be very charitable, I can say, okay, when I was a kid and I was at university, I agreed with many of these principles. And I would even say now as an adult, I would say on many of the things, I agree with the assessment of the problems that we face in culture. I agree with the way they view the world. And I agree with none of their proposed solutions. So they say, okay, here is a problem, here is a difficulty, here is a danger. And I say, you know what? I think you're right. That is a problem, that is a difficulty, that is a danger. I like inclusivity. I like fairness. I like justice. I don't like people being left out or bullied or targeted for anything. Sexual preference, lifestyle preferences, immutable characteristics like, I don't know, height, sex, ethnicity, things that you can't change. I don't like that either. But their solutions are insane. And their solutions are frequently racist and sexist and rooted in identity politics. I mean, I am guilty of original sin because I was born, because I had a certain genital shape, because I had a certain amount of melanin in my skin. That's not a reasonable proposition. That's not an adult proposition. This isn't new. These people who claim this type of thing have been around for a long time, but until about 10 years ago, we ignored them. And we should be ignoring them now. So my solution would be, let us be as intolerant of them as they are of us. Let's go back to ignoring them the way we used to. Don't punish them, don't hurt them, don't target them. I'm sorry, but much of this is largely mass hysteria and a symptom of a mass psychosis at this point.
If you were asked to define masculinity as opposed to femininity, I would claim that you would find it a challenge to do that without referencing physical strength, brawn, and the capacity for raw physical violence. In order for civilization and technological progress to take place, the process of technological process and the thing that civilization is itself must be protected by violence. But because we can't, to a nuance, divide masculinity from the capacity for physical violence itself, I think what happens is we get to a point where we say, okay, civilization requires people to live on top of each other. We can't have psychopathic, barbaric warlords next door to people whilst they're trying to tend their gardens, because they'll do terrible things to them and it'll destroy the fabric of society. So at a certain point, we inevitably, I claim, are going to end up turning the volume down on masculinity itself in an effort to turn the volume down on violence. Now, if you look at the major world religions that we have today, I would say the most populous ones, the most powerful ones, they were all actually an effort to take us into that period from the hunter-gatherer phase into agriculture and to living in cities alongside each other in a way where violent men wouldn't take advantage over weaker men, women, and children. That's why the commandments are written the way they are. That's why if you look at the Egyptian Book of the Dead, your soul at the end of your life is judged in a way that stops violent men from using raw, muscular power to just take what they want from people. In a certain sense, masculinity is antithetical to the civilizational process. I agree with that. The problem is, when we're looking to correct that, how do we stop attacking masculinity when we're just trying to turn violence down? I do not see a solution to that one. I actually think it's a problem that just will never go away. There's always going to be that dynamic tension there, where the safer we try to create the environment and the more civilized we become and the more technological progress we see, the more naturally feminized civilization will become, because masculinity has to be drained out of the system. Masculinity and masculine endeavors will inevitably become not au fait, not trendy, not cool. There'll be things that in the early phases will begin to be humiliated, not respected, not desired, and then eventually, along a long enough timeline, I am claiming, they will ultimately be criminalized. All civilizations every time will get to a point where they feel an impulse, whether they obey it or not, to criminalize masculinity. Where can masculinity comfortably exist inside of civilization? Outside of it. On the city walls, you can have guards, you can have soldiers. They can leave civilization and go and invade other places and bring back precious resources, but I don't want to live next door to a band of marauding soldiers. I'm sure you don't want to go to the supermarket and find active Vikings in there. Why would they queue? Why would they pay? Why would they obey any social constrictions whatsoever? They wouldn't. So they are actually the antithesis to civilization. The only secure and comfortable place for raw, authentic masculinity, I'm claiming, is outside of civilization. It is a problem that we certainly haven't even begun to address properly yet, let alone begin to solve.
Masculinity is outdated and is the source of all modern-day problems. How could you say otherwise?
Well, masculinity was a problem if you were suffering physical violence at the hands of men who wanted to take your life or your things or your land. Largely speaking, internally, solipsistically, to the civilization in question, masculinity represented a solution to a problem. Looking at it now, masculinity doesn't really solve many hard problems, other than if you are in a hot war. Previously, it did solve problems. Now, masculinity is a problem in and of itself. Now, I speak as somebody who is masculine, who is pro-masculinity. I hate the idea of attacking men for being men. I loathe the idea of attacking masculinity for its own sake. But I recognize that in terms of human progress and civilization, masculinity is intrinsically problematic, because I think it's indivisibly tied with physical violence. It is very, very hard to identify what masculinity is without referencing the warrior. And if you were an ultra spiritual person and you saw life in the softest hues imaginable, and you were a new ager, you would still reference the warrior archetype. And it's so weird the way we've reframed this, like people look up to the warrior archetype, and it's in modern society, it's associated with nobility and personal development and so on. And I just think that's a load of crap. The warrior archetype, if you're a warrior, you are a war maker and you're good at war. So fundamentally, somebody's getting their skull smashed in somewhere. That is what war is. It is brutality, it is destruction, and it is violence. I really don't like the way we're trying to retroactively do up warriorhood or warriorship in that way. It is what it is. Humans are not all the way good, all the way noble. Not everything we do is pretty and nice and acceptable. A lot of what we are is dark. It's ugly and violent and vicious and sadistic. At the end of the day, if you want more people inside of your civilization, if you want to repopulate, because people die, you need feminine women, masculine men who exist on a sexual polarity to come together in heterosexual union to have sex, to put sperm into egg, to make more people. If you demasculinize men, if you eradicate masculinity, then sex and procreation ultimately will stop. And we can already see signs of it slowing, and then you won't repopulate. And then you'll have a very old civilization full of old, sick people that will be very vulnerable, very weak, and ultimately will collapse.
So as we move into the cities, and we have more and more stuff, and consumer capitalism takes hold, it's pretty hard for intimacy to survive in that environment. It doesn't have air. You've got cities, people living on top of each other. It changes the drive. The drive becomes wanting to get away from people. You're physically surrounded by strangers all the time. God knows what that does to us hormonally, how much extra stress that creates, because again, well, it's not a good evolutionary match. We are not evolved to be surrounded and jostled by strangers. That is too much. It's too much data, it's too much information, and it's too much potential threat. What do we start to want to do when we're surrounded by so many other human beings? The drive then to seclude ourselves, to seek isolation, to rest from the oppression of other people's presence goes up. Added to that, instead of actual tribal recognition, what we have is sort of this culturally induced narcissistic drive for pseudo fame or cyber fame or social media recognition, a sort of narcissism light, if you will. So I'm driving for isolation. I've got narcissism light where I'm looking for recognition, but not from people I know, from strangers on the internet. And added into the mix, you've got this weird thing that's happening around sex and sexuality, masculinity and femininity, where it's all become controversialized. Under these conditions, intimacy really doesn't do very well. I mean, the fact that it survived at all, quite frankly, is a miracle. We no longer are as invested as we would have been in other environmental circumstances to connect with other people, and the risks are higher. So the cost of intimacy is now higher because I have to give up that precious privacy that I really want, that precious seclusion that reminds me I'm my own person. I'm not just a faceless member of a crowd, which is very stressful, as well as inducing narcissistic injury. But the potential risk, what could happen if I'm intimate with a stranger? What could happen if I am not even physically intimate, not necessarily sexually intimate? Any kind of intimacy is potentially painful because we open ourselves up and we make ourselves vulnerable. And here's one more thing you've got to remember. As the group of people living together grows beyond a certain point, I believe it's 150 people, accountability starts to significantly go down. You live in a group of 40 to 80 people and you do something messed up, everybody's going to know, and you will suffer because of that. Every single person is going to know that you did the shameful thing, and there will be consequences. You get into a group of 150, your misdeeds, your slights, your thefts, your little moments of criminality, they might not even get seen. And if they do get seen, nobody really knows you. Who's going to hold you to account? You take that to 1,500 people, 15,000 people, 150,000 people, the chances of you getting even caught go down and down and down, and accountability becomes almost non-existent. What we rely on in the modern world for accountability is a bureaucratic government-run police force to come and find you long after the misdeed, whatever it was, has happened, and hopefully we have enough evidence or witness accounts to throw you into a very lengthy, very unwieldy court process to try and deliver some sort of state-mandated justice. It's alienation again. Alienation is a key element to all of this. So in that costly environment where bad people can get away with doing pretty awful things to people as long as there's an intimate contact, intimacy shrivels. And the final thing that's added into that mix is that we're being culturally indoctrinated because of consumer capitalism to love things and use people. Intimacy is the enemy of corporations. Intimacy is the enemy of social media platforms. Intimacy is the enemy of the state. Any entity that prospers or profits from controlling your consciousness and directing your emotions doesn't want you to fall in love. I don't want you in love, having a picnic, a cheap picnic, by the way, a non-expensive picnic down by some place of natural beauty and just enjoying conversation. I can't tax your conversation. I can't tax you feeding the ducks. I can't tax you having a nice little giggle with your partner out there in the sunshine. That's of no use to me whatsoever. I need your eyeballs on the screen so I can get more advertisers invested. I need your mind being controlled by whatever news stories, propaganda essentially, that I'm pumping out so I can get you to vote the right way and feel the right way about the right issues. I need your consciousness being consumed with envy and greed so that you buy my car that I've built, or the sneakers that I built for you, or this expensive perfume that you need to have because it's identified with some other cultural icon whose fame you would like to share a part of. It's madness inducing. It's psychosis inducing. It induces loneliness, a fear of intimacy, a desire to escape from people and to escape into a sort of consumerist, individualist, pleasure-seeking narcissism. Why? Because we're so miserable, we're so wretched, we feel so bad inside of our own bodies, inside of our own emotions and our own physiological systems, that we think the only way out is to buy more stuff, get more likes, or jump on the next social activism campaign. It's a mess.
Dating and relationships today, I think in the modern West, is undeniably problematic. There are people who say, oh, it's all a trend, it's not that big of a deal. No, it's that big of a deal. We're in a real crisis as far as this goes. You are going to run into problems. With the best of intentions, you're going to run into problems. I think because intimacy itself is now a controversialized subject, as are gender roles, as is sexuality, as is simply being in a relationship. And it doesn't matter how you identify, it doesn't matter your sexuality, it doesn't matter if you're straight or gay or queer or trans, you are going to have problems. We live in an intimacy adverse culture. At an individual level, I would say we have to recognize that. We have to develop a philosophy to deal with the incredibly painful reality that we're living in right now, which is that intimacy in relationships has never been harder at any other time in recorded human history. We really must remove sexism. We really must train people away from prejudicial thinking. We need to encourage people not to be exploitative. We've got to get back to a sense of awe and respect and reverence for life, for ourselves and for other people, and to recognize, hey, that person I'm doing this to, they also have a will, they also have a heart, they also have feelings, they have hopes and dreams. I have no right to treat people like this. Just because legally you can, doesn't mean morally you should.
Are we evolved to need God? Now, I'm not asking, is God real, or is there a God, or which God or goddess should we pray to? I'm asking the question, is the human animal evolved to a point or in such a way, under such environmental pressures, where if they don't have God or gods, they feel uncomfortable? I can't answer that question. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I'm not an anthropologist. But I imagine that both groups of academics would say, well, across time and across space in multiple geographic regions, there are gods, there are goddesses, there are religions. And it looks like we've always had them as far back as recorded history. Usually, if you were a historian that would record history and you were a person who'd been educated and trained to read and write, that would be tied up within your religious beliefs and your religious practices too. In the same way that technology is an intrinsic part of civilization, perhaps we could posit that religion and religiosity, the religious impulse, the spiritual impulse, has also been an intrinsic part of civilization. When we were talking about masculinity, you could even say, look at some of the religious ideals, some of the religious archetypes. Are they not gods that watch over and direct the behavior of potential warriors or even warlords who are trying to live a civilized life, who are trying to control their impulses to rape, pillage, and steal other people's property? If the human animal does have a religious impulse, and if we're evolved to have religion and spirituality, what impact would it have if we go through a collective enlightenment and say, well, we're now only going to use reason and science, and we're going to adopt a purely mechanistic worldview, and we're going to lose God? Now, on the one hand, you might say, well, that means we're losing patriarchal, dictatorial, top-down authoritarian structure that delivers superego injunctions. Thou shalt do the sacred thing, thou shalt not do the sin. Yes, maybe. Don't we also lose a connection to the infinite? Don't we also lose a connection to a sense of the divine and awe and mystery? If we have a purely Western mechanistic view of ourselves and our bodies, doesn't it also move us towards more and more consumer capitalism? If I'm flesh and not spirit, if I'm just a being who has, 75 years on the planet and then nothing, doesn't it make sense for me to consume as much as possible, to aggrandize myself as much as possible, to pleasure myself as much as possible? Food, sex, wealth, narcissism, expressions of power, because this is all I have. I have 75 years to make it as big as I can, enjoy as much as I can, and it's finite. And if I, look at myself, I'm basically deteriorating stock. It's not going to go anywhere. Once it's done, and it had no meaning anyway. So why have a morality? Why have a drive to help others or charity or anything else? And I've heard arguments from the other side where atheists will say, well, no, you should do it because it's the right thing to do, or it's the moral thing to do. And I say, that's absolutely fine. I hear your arguments, and they're sound arguments. I largely agree with them. And yet, if we are evolved to have gods and goddesses, and now we don't, what is the consequence? So I've mentioned one of them. What's at the top? What's the overriding reason? What's the meaning? What's the structure? Nothing? The all-seeing eye of the Illuminati? Money? Really, how do we answer these questions? How do we answer the question, what is life for? How do we answer the question, why are we here? How do we answer the question, how should I live? I'm not saying let's go back to old religions, and I'm not absolving religions of the multiple sins that they are clearly guilty of, or at least the men, the women, the human beings in positions of power who exploited religious doctrine and dogma to fulfill narcissistic, psychopathic ends. What I am saying is probably believing that we're only flesh is a pretty depressing and anxiety-inducing perspective. It's a pretty dark and inherently nihilistic position to adopt. Maybe if we begin by saying, look, there's no reason for us to believe in a punishing or rewarding sky daddy that exists outside somewhere in heaven or space, who's watching over us and punishing us or rewarding us depending on how many times a day we pray to him or notice him or offer him narcissistic supply. Maybe it's enough to just say, okay, we don't know why we're here, and just bring that to the center of the conversation for a minute. There's so much we don't know. Science has taught us wonderful things and continues to and will continue to. But there's an awful lot it can't answer. And in the face of that, not to reject narcissism, which is unnecessary, but to embrace humility, embrace awe, embrace a sense of respect for the world that we did not create and that we do not fully understand and that perhaps we're never going to fully understand. And from that position to behave with a degree of humility, a degree of openness and uncertainty, respect for others, respect for the world that we're living in, respect for life itself, for creation itself. And to be impressed, to experience awe, to look around and say, this is pretty amazing, actually. Being alive now is a gift. This body, this moment, the people around me, the stars, the mountains, the seas, incredible, wonderful. I can appreciate that. And I don't have to keep putting myself, my priorities, my pleasures, my drives, my wants at the top of the pyramid of priority. A sense of the divine and the capacity to have awe for that which is, and to connect for that which is non-material, to try and connect to the infinite, to those things that existed long before we did, and to those parts of reality that will exist long after we're gone.